Let's take our Bibles and turn to Acts 24. There's 3 sections to this chapter. As an introduction, let's remember what led up to this. Paul had been apprehended in the temple and rescued by Claudius Lysias, the chief captain of the Roman guard, and tried to find out from the Jews what it was that they had against Paul when they brought him before the Sanhedrin. But that turned into a mess with the Pharisees on one side and the Sadducees on the other side, and they were about ready to tear Paul into pieces right there. Claudius Lysias had to rescue Paul twice. And then he found out that there were 40 men that had taken a vow that they would neither eat nor drink till they'd killed Paul. Now, Paul's a Roman citizen. And Claudius Lysias, it's his responsibility to protect Roman citizens. So under armed guard of about 470 men, 70 of them on horseback, they sent Paul to Caesarea, to Governor Felix. This was really probably a very wise thing Claudius Lysias did, because with so much attention on Paul and it being such a tense thing with the rulers of the Jews about Paul, well, really this is a job for Felix. And Claudius Lysias then wrote a letter to Felix. In that letter, if you remember, made himself look real good, as though he was the Savior here, and in reality he made himself look better than he really was. But then he said, I don't really know what they have against Paul. And so Felix asked Paul, where are you from? And Paul says, Cilicia. And Felix said, well, when thy accusers come to Caesarea, then I'll hear about this matter. And Paul was kept in Herod's judgment hall, which is no mean place. It was a very elaborate, beautiful, wonderful building. I mean, you'd think you were put up in a real nice place. Now, I bet Paul didn't have the nice room there when he was there, I'm sure. But it was a nice place for him to be incarcerated. All right, so that's where we come to Acts 24. 3 parts, Acts 24. Number 1, the Jews are going to come from Jerusalem, and we're going to hear the accusation they have against Paul. Number 2, Paul is going to make his defense. And then number 3, we're going to see what Felix does about this. So let's read the text, and I'll point out those 3 things, then we'll go back over it, and I'll show you a few, which I think are some very interesting details here as we go into it. So follow along in your Bible, if you will. It might help you sear it into your memory. If you haven't see it in your own Bible, you might want to make some little notes or things along the way, marks to kind of keep up with this. And here we go. Acts 24:1. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. We accepted always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all kindness. Notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. For we have found this man a pestilent fellow, and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of that sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned him to speech, we're getting into part 2 now, answered, for as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither rising up in the people, neither in the synagogue, nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and of the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself, to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. Or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me whilst I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice, that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I'm called in question by you this day. Now number 3, Felix's response. Verse 22. And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Here's your memory verse. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him, whereof he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. Okay, we're going to go back over that. I want to show you some interesting things here. First, I've got to correct myself. I've been talking about the high priest, Ananias, the high priest, and had him confused with Annas, the high priest. Now, there are several high priests we read about in the New Testament. The high priests are supposed to be of the sons of Aaron, who was the first high priest, the brother of Moses. But whether these were sons of Aaron or not was not really the issue at that time. These were political appointed priests. And so Caiaphas was the old high priest, but he'd gotten to be an old man, up in his 70s or 80s, which is really old for those days. And so he had his son-in-law to be made high priest. Now that's Annas, the high priest. And after Annas, I think the man's name was Jonathan, that became the high priest, which was the son of Caiaphas. But even Jonathan's not high priest now. It's Ananias, appointed by one of the Herods to be high priest. And that's not to be confused with Annas. So there's Annas and Ananias. So this is now Ananias, the high priest. Now I want to make sure we got that correction. Took 5 days. Well, I can imagine it'd take 5 days. They had to get their act together, get their case, had to find out where Paul went. Remember, they were going to call him that next morning, but have those men kill him on the way to their judgment hall. So after 5 days, they show up. And just think of Felix now. Here they show up to Felix, the governor, and this isn't just anybody accusing Paul. This is the high priest. So this is a very politically sensitive matter. that lies before Felix, because it's his responsibility to make sure Roman law is upheld, and that means a proper protection and treatment of Paul, the Roman citizen. It's also his responsibility to make sure he keeps peace and keeps things settled down there in Israel. And when the leaders there in Israel, in Jerusalem, have a matter, he's got to take that very seriously. So politically, Felix is going to have to be very politically astute in how he does that. And there's no doubt that is weighing on his mind more than the righteousness of how this ought to be judged. He's thinking, how am I going to handle this political situation in the best way that would please Rome? Because if Rome is pleased, he's going to be okay. Let me tell you a little bit about this Felix. Doing the background studies to all this, there's a man named Tacitus. And Tacitus wrote the Annals of Rome, the history of Rome. And he tells about Felix that Felix was born as a slave. And for someone who had been a slave to have risen this high in the government of Rome, now he's no longer a slave, but still that's where he came from. And for being from a slave all the way up to being the governor of Judea was really quite a feat there in Rome. Felix had a lot of political smarts on how to take care of himself. But Tacitus says he was also very cruel and ruthless, and he governed like a slave and a tyrant. And so that's where Paul has come. Now, he descended with the elders. Now, these were those men of high regard, men of the Sanhedrin there in Jerusalem, and they descended. Always remember, Jerusalem's up in the hills. And you come out of the hills going down toward Caesarea, which is down on the seacoast. If we had the Smoky Mountain version of the Bible, we might say that Ananias came out of the hills with the elders, is the way we'd put that. So he descended down to Caesarea with a certain orator named Tertullus. Now you talk to any judge, and a lot of things can happen in a courtroom, and a judge would really like the plaintiffs that come before him to have lawyers. It's possible you could argue your own case in some cases, but judges usually don't like that. Why is that? Well, lawyers understand the whole system, and they know what's appropriate to bring up and not, and how to represent, and so judges would usually like to have lawyers. And that's sort of what this Tertullus was. It is a Roman name, and it calls him an orator. So he's not necessarily an expert in the law, but they're thinking, we'll hire this orator here to speak for us before Felix, because Felix will like that. And he'll be able to spell our case, represent us very well. So Paul's up against the professionals here. Now, he informed the governor against Paul. And when he was called forth, now notice how Tertullus, now he's just going to lay it on thick and flattering Felix. Just notice in fact he says about as much about how wonderful Felix is as he does about how awful Paul is. And so he says, he began to accuse him. And I understand that word accuse is really a technical legal term in formally placing a charge now against Paul. He began to accuse him, saying that by thee we enjoy great quietness. Well, see, that was Felix's job, make sure things stay quiet. And the hypocrisy here is this: the Jews did not like Felix. There was too much trouble while Felix was there. It does say that that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, and that was true. Felix had done some important things to take care of the people, but there wasn't quietness. In fact, in 2 years, Felix is going to be displaced because of the turmoil that exists. The Jews actually sent representatives to Rome to complain to Caesar against Felix about his mismanagement and how upset people were in that land. Well, but now here, when they're standing before him, look what they say. We enjoy great quietness, and the very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence. You ever heard that word, providence? We talk a lot about the providence of God. What was Felix's job here? To kind of work and make sure everything came out all right for Judea. That's what. Did you know this is the only place the word providence is found in the Bible? And yet this idea of God's providence is throughout the Bible. And we talk freely about, well, it was providential, or there's God's providence here. And that is how God, in ways that He has not explained to us, but God works things out, doesn't He? So a lot of things, it just seem to work out. We thank God for that. We talk about general providence and special providence and miraculous providence. A lot of time we're talking about providence, we're talking about how God does things in the unseen hand of God, in non-miraculous ways, working in the lives of people. And yet this is the only place that word is found. I find that kind of interesting. God's providence is everywhere, but it is so hidden that it's not even named in the Bible. This isn't talking about God's providence, it's Felix's providence. I just found that interesting. Now, we accepted always in all places, most noble Festus, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Most noble Felix. Does that remind you of something? Remember when Luke wrote the book of Luke and Acts, he addressed it to most noble Theophilus? See, that term, most noble, is a term you use. It's a sort of a term of official honor. And we often call the judge, Your Honor. It's just a formal manner of honor to the position. And so that's the way that's used here. Like it is with Theophilus, which gives us some idea of maybe who Theophilus was. Some kind of government official himself that Luke is informing about Paul's case, because Paul's about to go before Nero. But coming on here, we accept it with all thankfulness, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee. And you know, some people go on and on, they can't get tedious, can't they? He said, not be tedious, and I pray thee that thou wouldest hear of thy clemency a few words. In other words, you've just granted us the very favor of even listening to us, and so I won't be tedious. Let me give you a few words. And to me, it sounds like he's already being tedious, doesn't it to you? Well, let's see what he says. We found this man a pestilent fellow. Now that's worse than just being a pest. You know, a little sister can be a pest, can't she? Okay. We're not just talking about a pest. A pestilence is a disease. Paul is spreading trouble around here, and it's catching on to other folks. It's just like a disease that has broken out among your people, Felix. We found him a pestilent fellow. It says, a mover of sedition among the Jews throughout the world. Absolutely false. Paul has never moved the Jews to sedition. Sedition is a rebellion against authority. If anything, Paul taught the Christians that they need to be submissive to the powers that be. It's absolutely a false charge, but that's what he's going to do, charge Paul falsely. A ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. What do you think of a ringleader? I think of the circus fella down there in the center of the ring. He's kind of orchestrating everything from the center there. That's who Paul is. Of the sect of the Nazarenes. What's he talking about? See, there is no sect of the Nazarenes. That's something he just made up. Nazareth. You remember Nazareth? Remember, it was Nathaniel, they said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Nazareth didn't have a good reputation. Nazareth was kind of a mean, little, ugly city up there in Galilee. And just the very fact that you'd come from Nazareth put you down to begin with. And Galilee was known for those people that were rebelling against. I mean, they were radical. That's where the zealots were, up in Galilee against Rome. And so he's made up this little sect of the Nazarenes that didn't even exist. Said, now Paul, see, he's trying to stir up this problem here among this sect. You may have heard of a denomination that calls itself the Nazarenes. You ever heard of the Nazarenes? It's kind of a spin-off off of the Methodist Church. It's not quite into the holiness Pentecostal camp, but it's somewhere in between the Methodist and the Pentecostals are this Nazarene denomination. They claim to be the true followers of John Wesley, the Nazarenes. Why do they call themselves the Nazarenes? Well, they tell me it's because the church was called a sect of the Nazarenes in the New Testament. Listen, this is not a denominational name, and it's not a name given by the Holy Spirit. This is given by Tertullius, this orator that's laying false charges against Paul. And it's a sect that never even existed. And so but they call themselves this. That's where they get that name. Paul, who has also gone about to profane the temple. Well, he didn't do any such thing. Paul understood the temple and how to manage yourself in the temple so as not to profane it. And the charge laid against him that he had brought a Gentile in the temple, that wasn't true. But it says, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. In other words, we were going to handle this, so you didn't have to fool with this. But Claudius Lysias, Then Paul, wait a minute, where did I skip? Yeah, we would have handled it to our law. But see, the thing is, it's like, they never should have taken him away. He shouldn't even be in your court. You just let us deal with this. Well, Paul makes his defense. The governor beckoned with him to speak. You see the governor there? Kind of turned to Paul. Make a motion. Hey, your turn. What do you have to say for yourself? So let's hear the other side. Paul answered, for as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Now that is a compliment to Felix, but it's not laying on thick flattery, like Tertullius was doing, was it? And he says for many years. As I understand it, from the histories, they have determined that Felix had been governor of Caesarea over Judea for about 7 years. That's a long time to judge this hard to govern people. And so Paul says, because thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up for Jerusalem for to worship. Paul had only been in Jerusalem. Only got there 12 days ago. And 5 of those days we know he was in Caesarea. That leaves only 7 days. And you think what all the charge they laid against Paul, how could he have done all that in 7 days? He hadn't even been in Jerusalem enough time to have caused the kind of trouble they're accusing him of. And during that time they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, nor raising up the people, neither in the synagogue nor in the city. They never saw me doing anything like this they're charging me. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. Listen, I worship the same God they worship. And I believe the same law and the writings of the prophets that they say they believe. Now, he also understood the proper application of those law and the prophets they didn't understand, but it wasn't as though he was doing something outside of the ordinary that they should have allowed under their religion. And he used the word heresy, which they called heresy. In the King James Version, they translated that word 2 ways in this chapter. And it would have pleased me if they'd used the one word. Because when Tertullius talked about the sect of the Nazarenes, the Greek word translated sect there is the same word translated heresy here. So they call this a sect, is what Paul is saying. It would be the heresy of the Nazarenes. And this is that heresy. The sect of the Nazarenes, they call this a sect. So it's the same word. But he said, that's how I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things written in the law of the prophets, and have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow. The hope he has was allowed in their system, while all the Pharisees believed this, and they allowed the Pharisees that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Remember when he said that in the Sanhedrin, that's when Ananias said, hit him in the mouth, smite him in the mouth. Well, he said it again. Ananias is sitting right there. He didn't say to smite him in the mouth this time, did he? And so he declares to Felix, I've done it all good conscience, but toward God and man. And that's very complimentary. And I want you to notice something that we may overlook sometime. We need to live in good conscience toward God in all things. Now, if we're wrong, we need to get that right, because our conscience can be wrong. But even when Paul did not understand what he ought to do right, at least he had a good conscience about it, but also before men. Have you ever thought about living in good conscience before men? Living in such a way that I'm not ashamed for any man to tell the truth about me. I've treated everyone right, and so I've lived in good conscience before God and before men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. He'd been gone from Jerusalem about 5 years, and during that time, he'd been collecting money for the poor saints in Jerusalem. But it wasn't for saints only, was it? You remember in Galatians where he says we're to do good unto all men, especially those that are of the household of faith? And Paul says he brought alms to his nation, not to his church, to his nation. That includes all men. Now, it's especially for the saints in Jerusalem, but this idea that some people have that you can't use the Lord's money out of the budget to help someone that's not a member of the church, that's not what the Bible teaches. So it was especially, we're going to take care of our own, but we can help others as well. So, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple. He wasn't raising a ruckus, and there's a procedure to go through for being purified that Paul had been a part of, and so he wouldn't have had an opportunity to raise a tumult in the temple. Neither with the multitude, nor with the tumult when they found me. And they should have been here, who ought to have been here before thee and object if they had aught against me. Those who had accused Paul in the temple of bringing a Gentile in the temple weren't even there at the trial. They had something to say. They should have showed up themselves, said it themselves. Or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be with this one voice, that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, and am I called in question to you this day? And that's what he did when he was on trial at the Sanhedrin, remember? He believed in the resurrection, and that divided the Sadducees and Pharisees. See what Felix is going to do about this. When Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred and said, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I'll know the uttermost of your matter. I'm not going to make a decision now. I'll wait till I hear from Lysias, and then I'll make a decision. So he sent them all home. Now, we never read about Lysias coming down and talking to him. I would imagine he did, and they had some communication about this, but this is the last said about that. He commanded a centurion to keep Paul. That centurion would have 100 men at his disposal to make sure Paul was kept well. And it not just keep him under guard, but keep him safe from those who would harm him. And gave him a lot of freedom there in Herod's judgment hall. He said, let him have liberty. that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. And after certain days, when Philip came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. He brought his wife in, Drusilla. Do you remember Herod Agrippa? Herod Agrippa was that Herod that had James beheaded and had cast Peter into prison, and had been an orator before the people when the people said, "It is of God and not of man," and he was smitten of worms and he died. Drusilla is his daughter. This was Felix's third wife and Drusilla's second husband. You know anybody like that today? I bet you do. And what Paul's going to do is teach the truth to them. What do you do with these people that get themselves so tied up in these marriages that are not lawful, that don't have God's approval? What are you going to do in a situation like that? Don't do what Paul did. You're going to teach them the truth. And here's what Paul did. Said, he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. What a sermon for Felix and Drusilla. Righteousness has to do with doing what is right in God's eyes. Temperance, that has to do with control of your passions. And so he reasoned with Felix. Felix, I tell you what, here's what we ought to do. Well, I would love to have heard Paul reason with him and explain it is so important that we live our lives in a manner that is right in God's sight. And we need to control ourselves and not just give in to our passions. We need to be temperate in all things, something neither Felix nor Drusilla had done. And then he told him about the judgment to come. See, you're going to be held accountable for this. They're sinners in God's sight. And Paul must have done a very good job. Because when he got through, it says Felix trembled. And we need to preach the truth of God so clear and so absolute. And sinners here, they need to tremble. And here's what Felix said. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. Oh, the devil's in there somewhere. If the devil can just get you to put it off. Oh, yeah. You got to deal with this, but deal with it later. You know, it's just not convenient right now. Now, I hear from the accounts from Tacitus about Drusilla. Drusilla's a very good-looking woman. She was real pretty. That's why Felix got her away from her first husband, took him to himself. You know, when is it real convenient to get rid of a pretty wife? You think of a convenient time to do that? Well, what about his position? Now, he's the governor of these Jews. And it's his job to keep peace and settled here. And he wouldn't like it if I became a Christian. Now, when's it going to be convenient, Felix, for you to step out of being governor and become a Christian? Felix probably thinking, you know, this job paying me pretty good right now. I can't forego that kind of income. Well, I've got all these obligations, and okay, when is it going to be convenient to walk away from a worldly fortune and to sell all you have and give it to the poor and come and follow Christ? When's that going to be convenient? It's never going to be convenient. And the devil knows that. And that's why the devil keeps saying, wait till it's convenient. Put it off till it's convenient. Look, you've been involved in this a long time. It's not convenient now. Wait until it's too late. Well, After this settled down, Felix returned to old Felix. He thought maybe he could get some money out of this. Paul raised all this money for his nation. Maybe I could get them. Maybe I get a bribe out of him. And so he brought Paul, sent him to him the oftener, and communed with him, but he didn't get anywhere with Paul. Paul was going to be right, and he wasn't going to give in to this bribe stuff. And so that didn't get him anywhere. And after 2 years, here's Paul kept as a prisoner unjustly. 2 years. Now, it wasn't like he's in solitary confinement. He had a lot of liberty and people could come see him, but for 2 years now. And he never did deal with it. To please the Jews, he just kind of kept him locked up over there. And then when Felix was displaced, they sent him, it's for Porcius Festus to come in. And one of the first things Festus is going to have to do is deal with Paul's case. And we'll read about that then in the next chapter. Okay? Well, that is just so interesting to me. The insight it gives into what's going on there and how Paul conducted himself and how this whole case is working out. And we'll see. I'll follow this all the way to Rome with Paul and see what leads up, but we don't see exactly how it's going to come out. That's the thing, but we'll see. But now by way of invitation, here we go. Is it convenient? Now is the accepted time. And don't wait till it's convenient. If something's wrong, time to get that right is now. You say, I'll wait till it's convenient, and the devil knows this. And the devil will keep making sure it's never convenient. And so don't delay. If there's something that you need to take care of that's wrong, you need to get it straight now. If you need to be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins, don't put that off. Do it now. And if you've harmed or sinned against your brother, you need to get that straight at this time. So if you need to respond to the invitation, do it as we stand and sing.